There are moments in history when a single piece of paper carries enough weight to shift an entire empire, and tonight we open the door to one of those moments. The kind of moment Walt Disney himself likely hoped the world would never revisit. The document at the center of this investigation is not a rumor, not a myth whispered in fan circles, but a letter written in Walt's own hand that vanished from the official archives without a trace. A disappearance so deliberate, so calculated, that it raises a question no corporation ever wants to face. What exactly was so dangerous about this letter that it had to be buried? For decades, the Disney archives have presented themselves as immaculate, exhaustive, complete. Every sketch, every memo, every scrap of creative history cataloged with obsessive precision. Yet this letter slipped through the cracks, or was pushed. And when something vanishes inside an institution built on preservation, it leaves behind a quiet, persistent echo. An echo that suggests intent. Tonight, we follow that echo. Our investigation begins with three intersecting paths. A former archivist who insists the letter never should have existed, a private collector who claims to have seen a second document referencing it, and an internal memo from the late 1960 seconds hinting that disruptive correspondence was removed under direct instruction. These fragments form a puzzle no one at the company wants reassembled. But the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't just a personal note or creative dispute. Something inside that letter threatened the image Walt Disney spent a lifetime constructing. Something significant enough that, even after his death, others continued protecting it. And the most unsettling truth? This letter might not have been the only one. To understand why this letter mattered so much, we have to return to a moment when the Disney Empire stood at a crossroads. 1965, a year marked by expansion, internal conflict, and decisions that would define the company's future long after Walt's death. It was during this period that references to the missing letter first appear, buried inside routine correspondence that should have been forgettable. Yet the tone of these documents is anything but routine. They read like warnings, subtle, coded, and anxious. One memo, written by an executive known for his loyalty to Walt, mentions a personal communication that must not circulate beyond the intended desk. Another refers to the implications if the contents were ever misunderstood. These phrases feel like the linguistic fingerprints of a corporation bracing for fallout. But fallout from what? A creative disagreement? A financial misstep? Or something more personal, rooted not in business but in Walt himself? The former archivist we contacted who requested anonymity claims the letter was removed shortly after Walt's passing. He remembers his supervisor arriving before dawn, gloves on, silent, carrying a slim folder that looked painfully ordinary. When questioned, the supervisor simply said, "This is legacy protection." The archivist insists he never saw the folder again. Meanwhile, the private collector who alleges the existence of a second document provides another piece of the puzzle. He describes an ambiguous reference to the first letter as though employees at the time acknowledged a sequence, a series, something ongoing, something that didn't end with a single piece of paper. As these fragments assemble, a pattern emerges. This wasn't just a letter hidden accidentally or misplaced in a crowded archive. It was removed with intention, guarded with vigilance, and spoken about only in half-truths. What was Walt trying to say, and who feared it the most? To get closer to the truth, we focused on the people who were closest to Walt during the final years of his life: animators, project leads, and studio staff whose careers unfolded in the shadow of his increasingly secretive decisions. Many of them describe a shift, subtle at first, but unmistakable. Walt became more guarded, more strategic, more aware that every word he wrote could ripple far beyond the studio walls. It's within this atmosphere that the missing letter was born, and the testimonies surrounding it feel less like recollections and more like fragments of a controlled detonation. One former animator recalls hearing whispers about a message Walt regretted writing the moment he sealed it. Another mentions a tense meeting between Walt and a high-ranking executive, the kind of meeting where doors were locked, blinds were drawn, and no one dared stand too close. None of these accounts confirmed the letter's contents, but they all share a tone, a quiet, nervous reverence, as though the letter touched a nerve no one wanted exposed. But the most compelling clue comes from a set of internal notes stored in an unrelated file, discovered by accident during our research. In the margins of one document, an employee scribbled a cryptic line: "If the original surfaces, everything shifts." That sentence, buried inside a folder about park logistics, feels almost like a warning left for someone who might stumble upon it decades later. Then there's the recurring phrase that emerges across several archived interviews: "It wasn't meant for the company. It was meant for someone specific." That single implication reframes everything. A private message, written by Walt at a volatile moment, could threaten reputations, narratives, or even entire projects if interpreted outside its intended context. And if the letter had a recipient, then someone out there knows exactly what it said. If someone out there truly knew what the letter contained, the trail would inevitably lead beyond the walls of the studio. That realization pushed our investigation toward a network of retired employees, private historians, and collectors who trade in items the company never officially acknowledges exist. Among them, one figure stands out, a collector known for acquiring documents through channels that remain deliberately vague. He wouldn't show us the rumored second reference letter, but he did allow us to examine a transcript he claims was copied from an internal conversation in the early 1970 seconds. In that transcript, a studio executive mentions the fallout from the correspondence, followed by a chilling note: "If the primary letter resurfaces, the narrative collapses." This phrase, "the narrative collapses," suggests that the contents of the original letter might challenge the foundational mythology surrounding Walt himself. Not a scandal, not a contrived controversy, but a truth powerful enough to shift how history remembers him. For a company built on carefully framed legacy, controlling that truth would be essential. Another unexpected lead came from a former Imagineer who worked on early Florida projects. He shared a story about a locked drawer in a supervisor's office rumored to contain the only surviving clue to a communication Walt regretted. While he never saw the letter, he recalls being told, "Some stories stay off the record for a reason." His expression when repeating that line was uneasy, as though repeating the warning alone carried weight. Then, during a late-night review of archived interviews, we found a striking pattern. Every time the letter is mentioned, indirectly, every hint, every coded reference, the tone shifts. Voices soften. Sentences trail off. People choose their words carefully, almost fearfully, as if protecting something or someone. And yet, these guarded silences reveal something unmistakable. The disappearance wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Once we accepted that the disappearance was orchestrated, our next step was to identify who had both the authority and the motivation to bury the letter. That led us into a maze of internal power shifts occurring in the final years of Walt's life, years marked by health concerns, ambitious expansions, and a leadership structure quietly preparing for the inevitable transition. In this environment, information wasn't just managed, it was weaponized, and a letter written directly by Walt, outside the approved channels, could disrupt the delicate balance executives were scrambling to maintain. Our investigation uncovered a confidential personnel report from 1967 describing a restricted directive related to posthumous materials. While the report never names the letter directly, it mentions a sensitive communication requiring sequestration. That word sequestration isn't typical corporate language. It implies containment, removal, purposeful isolation. It also appears again, months later, in an internal note connected to the archives department. The fingerprints of the same decision makers are everywhere. Faint but consistent. One retired administrator we contacted described an unusual meeting that took place days after Walt's death. A gathering of only 4 individuals, all high-ranking, all with direct access to his personal files. She recalled a moment when one executive said, "Certain things will stay between us, for the company's protection." She didn't understand what he meant at the time. Now, decades later, she's convinced that meeting determined the letter's fate. Then comes the eerie convergence. Multiple sources claiming the letter referenced a major project once still in development at the time, and that its true purpose had been misunderstood. If Walt's message contradicted internal plans or exposed internal fractures, removing it might have felt, to some,
like preserving stability. But there's one final, unresolved clue that reframes everything. The persistent rumor of a second letter, a follow-up, a response. A piece of the story that may still be out there, unseen, unarchived, and dangerously revealing. If the first letter was buried to protect a legacy, then the possibility of a second letter changes the stakes entirely. It means Walt wasn't simply expressing a moment of doubt, frustration, or warning. He was beginning a conversation. A conversation someone else might have tried to end. And as we retrace the final steps of this investigation, the hints pointing to that second document grew impossible to ignore. A set of interview notes from 1971 dismissed for decades as irrelevant contains a brief but striking line from a former executive. The follow-up never reached its destination. It's written almost casually, as if summarizing a logistical hiccup. But the surrounding context makes it clear that this follow-up referred to correspondence directly involving Walt. If this second letter was intercepted, misplaced, or deliberately removed, it suggests that what Walt wrote in the first letter may have provoked a response deemed too sensitive to exist. Private collectors whisper about it cautiously, describing it as the missing half of a confession, or the page that explains the first page. One historian even believes the second letter might have contradicted later corporate decisions, revealing intentions Walt hadn't yet shared publicly, a revelation that could rewrite how the company's most iconic projects were conceived. And then there's the final piece. A damaged microfilm reel stored in a mislabeled box, containing fragments of archival correspondence. Among the torn images, a single phrase stands out, half visible but unmistakably real. Regarding the previous letter, clarity is crucial before action. That one sentence confirms what the company has never acknowledged, that the first letter wasn't an isolated message. It was part of a developing narrative, one that someone worked very hard to erase. We may never uncover both letters in full, but every silence, every redaction, every vanishing document points to one truth. Walt Disney left behind a message the world was never meant to read. And if this investigation brought you something new, consider subscribing, sharing, commenting, and leaving a like. It truly helps this channel continue uncovering stories that were never meant to be found.